My name is Simone Ellery. I am 31 years old, and 11 days before my husband died, someone forged his signature on a document that was supposed to protect our daughter for the rest of her life. I didn't find that out right away. I found it out the way most people find out the truth in my family. Late, sideways, and from a stranger instead of the people who owed it to me. Marcus had been a wildland firefighter for 9 years when I met him. He smelled like wood smoke even on his days off, and he laughed at his own jokes half a second before anyone else did, like he couldn't help himself. We met at a diner near the fire station where I worked as a physical therapist, both of us the only ones eating alone on a Tuesday night, and he asked if he could sit at my table because the other booths were sticky with syrup nobody had bothered to wipe down. I found out later that wasn't true, that he just wanted an excuse to keep talking to me. And I found that out because his captain told me at our wedding, laughing like it was the best story he had about him. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed, on a Tuesday again, at the same diner, with a ring he'd bought with 3 months of overtime pay from a bad fire season he never liked to talk about in detail. He wasn't a man who performed his feelings for an audience. He showed you where he stood by what he did with his hands. Fixing the loose step on my porch the second weekend he ever came over, memorizing how I took my coffee before I'd told him twice, driving 4 hours each way to sit with his grandmother every month even after she stopped remembering his name. We got married in a courthouse in April because he said big weddings were for people who needed an audience to believe they were in love, and we didn't. I was 3 months pregnant by the time we signed the paperwork, though we hadn't planned it that way. Our daughter Iris was born the following January, and Marcus held her in the hospital hallway for almost an hour before he'd let anyone else touch her, like he was memorizing something. He had 2 life insurance policies. One came through his department, $150,000, standard for the job. The other was a private supplemental policy, $350,000, that he'd taken out the year before we met, back when he was younger and reckless and thought about his own mortality more than most 26-year-olds do. When we got married, he called the insurance company from our kitchen table and changed the beneficiary on both policies to me. I remember because he made a joke about it, something about finally being worth something to somebody. I told him to stop talking like that. He said he was a firefighter, not a pessimist. There was a difference. $500,000 total. I want you to hold on to that number because it matters more than once in this story. I met my parents for the first time as Marcus's fiancée at a Sunday dinner 8 months before we married, and I remember being struck by how carefully everyone at that table managed my sister. Dana was 24 then, between jobs, living in an apartment my parents quietly covered half the rent on, and every conversation seemed to route around her the way a river routes around a fallen tree. Nobody mentioned the rent. Nobody mentioned the credit card my mother had co-signed for her the year before, the one Dana had maxed out buying furniture for an apartment she left 4 months later. I only learned about these things gradually, the way you learn the wiring of a house you didn't build, one exposed wall at a time. My mother had a phrase she used whenever the subject came close to the surface. She'd say Dana just needs a little more time to find her footing, as if footing were something that arrived on its own schedule, instead of something people sometimes had to be allowed to struggle for. Marcus liked my family well enough in the ordinary way you like your spouse's family, with affection and a healthy distance. He got along with my father over grilling and baseball. He teased my mother out of her seriousness more successfully than I ever managed. He was gentler with Dana than I was. Actually, he'd sit with her on the porch during holidays and let her talk about whatever crisis was current without ever once making her feel like a burden. Which I think is part of why, when I finally read her name on that forged form, some small unreasonable part of me searched for a version of events where Marcus himself had somehow wanted this, where his kindness toward her extended even into a decision he never got the chance to make. I let myself believe that for almost 2 full days before the dispatch logs made it impossible to keep believing. In September, Marcus got sent out on a 14-day deployment to fight the Cedar Ridge Fire, 340 miles from home. Long deployments weren't unusual. What was unusual was that on day 11, a spot fire jumped containment lines faster than the crew could move, and Marcus didn't make it back to the rig in time. I got the call at 6:40 in the morning. Iris was 8 months old. She'd just started pulling herself up on the coffee table the week before, and Marcus had missed it, and he was never going to see it now. I don't remember most of the next month. I remember signing a death certificate. I remember my mother, Carol, staying in my guest room for the first 2 weeks, cooking meals I didn't eat and answering my phone when I couldn't. I remember my father, Gerald, standing in my driveway for a long time before he came inside, like he was working up to something. I remember my sister Dana showing up with her own baby, a boy 4 months younger than Iris. And I remember thinking, distantly, that it was strange timing, 2 babies born so close together in a family that hadn't had a new baby in over a decade before that year. At the reception after the funeral, my father found me in the kitchen of my own house, refilling a coffee urn nobody had asked me to refill, because it was easier than standing in the living room accepting condolences from people who kept calling Marcus a hero, like the word could fill the space where he used to be. Gerald stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, the way I remembered him doing in my driveway weeks earlier. "You know your mother and I will always take care of you," he said. "But I hope, once things settle, you'll think about your sister too. She's got a baby now, and no husband, and nothing behind her. You've got the house paid off. You'll have the department benefits. You'll be all right." I told him I hadn't even thought about insurance yet, that I could barely think about anything past the next hour, and he nodded like that was the answer he expected, and patted my shoulder and went back to the living room. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief has a way of making even strange conversations feel like background noise. It wasn't until months later, reading the courier log with Gerald's own signature on it, that I understood he hadn't been asking me to consider helping Dana. He'd been road testing an explanation for something that had already been done. Dana's situation was complicated in a way my family didn't like to say out loud. Her son's father wasn't in the picture. She'd moved back in with our parents 4 months before Marcus died, and from what I understood, she owed somewhere close to $40,000, a mix of credit cards and a car loan she'd taken out, believing a relationship that ended before the baby was born. Nobody in my family said the word debt directly. They said things like, "Dana's had a hard year," or "Dana just needs some stability right now." I understood the subtext. I didn't resent it. I had my own hard year happening in real time. 6 weeks after the funeral, I called the insurance company to start the claims process. I wasn't in a hurry, exactly. I was underwater in a different way, the kind where filling out forms felt like an act of aggression against my own grief. But the mortgage didn't care how I felt, and neither did the daycare I was going to need eventually, and neither did the number in my head that I'd been carrying since April, the number that was supposed to be the floor under Iris and me for as long as we needed it. A representative named Priya walked me through the intake. She asked for my identification, Marcus's death certificate, our marriage certificate, routine. Then she went quiet on the other end of the line for longer than felt normal, and when she came back, her voice had changed. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm showing that both policies were already paid out, about 5 weeks ago." I remember asking her to repeat that, not because I hadn't heard her, but because I needed a second version of the sentence to exist before I let myself believe the first one. "The primary beneficiary of record filed a claim and it was processed," she said. "I can't share who received it without additional verification, but I can confirm the funds were dispersed." "I'm the beneficiary," I said. "I've been the beneficiary since April of last year." "According to our system," Priya said carefully, "the beneficiary designation was updated 11 days before your husband's passing." 11 days. That was the number that started the second half of my life. I asked her to send me everything she could send me, And I hung up, and I sat on my kitchen floor with Iris's baby monitor crackling on the counter, and I did the math out loud to nobody. 11 days before Marcus died was day 3 of a 14-day fire deployment, 340 miles from our kitchen table. He had a department-issued satellite phone for emergencies and nothing else. He hadn't been near a fax machine or a notary or a mailbox in 11 days. I knew that because I'd been the one tracking his rotation on a laminated calendar stuck to our fridge, counting down to when he'd come home. Whoever signed that form, it wasn't him. The documents arrived 4 days later. I made myself read them at the kitchen table instead of the couch, because I wanted to be sitting somewhere that felt like a decision instead of a collapse. The form was a standard change of beneficiary request, the same kind Marcus had filled out the day he called from our kitchen and made his joke about finally being worth something. This one named Dana Whitfield as primary beneficiary at 100%, replacing me entirely. At the bottom was a signature that looked close to Marcus's, if you didn't know his handwriting the way I did. His M always had a hook on the second stroke, a habit from a shop teacher in high school who used to mark him down for it. This M didn't have the hook. Below the signature was a notary stamp and a certification block, filled out by a woman named Denise Kowalczyk, stating that Marcus Ellery had appeared before her in person on the date in question and signed the document in her presence. I looked her up that same night. Denise Kowalczyk ran a small mailbox and notary shop 2 miles from my parents' house. She and my mother had gone to the same church for over 15 years. I found a photo of the two of them together on a community fundraiser page from the spring before, standing shoulder to shoulder at a bake sale table, smiling like people who trusted each other completely. I didn't call my parents that night. I called a lawyer. Her name was Adacy Okonkwo, and she'd handled an insurance dispute for a friend of mine 2 years earlier, a much smaller case involving a denied auto claim, but I remembered that my friend had described her as somebody who didn't flinch. I told her everything on the phone, the deployment dates, the dispatch schedule, the notary, the M without the hook. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me the only question that mattered. "Can you prove where your husband physically was on that date?" I could. Fire departments keep exhaustive records during active deployments. Check-in logs, GPS tracking on department vehicles, radio transmission logs, even meal counts at the base camp. Marcus's captain, a woman named Odalis Ferreira who'd known him for 6 years, confirmed within a day that his crew had been actively engaged on the Cedar Ridge containment line on the exact date the notary certification claimed he'd walked into a strip mall 2 miles from my parents' house and signed a legal document in person. That was the piece that made this different from a family disagreement. That was the piece that made it a crime. Adias filed a formal fraud complaint with the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit the following week, along with the demand that all disbursed funds be frozen and traced. Before she filed, she sent me to a forensic document examiner named Priscilla Okafor, someone the firm had used before in contested will cases, so that we'd have our own independent analysis ready instead of waiting on the insurer's internal review. I brought Priscilla 17 years of Marcus's signatures, his high school yearbook, his academy graduation certificate, 2 years of tax returns, the mortgage document, a birthday card he'd written for his captain the year before. She spread them across a conference table in an order that made my chest hurt, watching his handwriting mature from a teenager's careless scrawl into the steady, hooked M he'd signed everything with for over a decade. She didn't need more than 20 minutes with the disputed form to tell me, carefully, in the measured language professionals use when they already know something but need to say it in a way that will hold up later, that the signature showed inconsistent pressure patterns and a stroke order that didn't match any of the 17 exemplars in front of her. I also gave a recorded statement to the insurance company's investigator, a soft-spoken man named Terrence Boyle, who'd clearly done this exact interview hundreds of times and had learned to ask questions without any judgment in his voice, which somehow made it harder to answer them. He asked me to walk him through the deployment calendar on my refrigerator, photograph by photograph. He asked whether Marcus had ever expressed any intention to change his beneficiary. He asked if I was aware of any financial disputes between myself and my sister prior to my husband's death. I told him no, because it was true, because until that phone call with Priya, I hadn't known there was anything to dispute at all. I want to be honest about something. I still hadn't confronted my family directly. Part of me was waiting for an innocent explanation to present itself, the way you sometimes wait for a bruise to turn out to be nothing even after you've already felt how much it hurts. Part of me knew there wasn't going to be one, and I wanted the evidence locked down before anyone had the chance to destroy it. The confrontation happened because Dana forced it, not because I chose the timing. She posted a video online 8 weeks after the funeral, walking through a house she and my parents were staying in temporarily while she looked for something bigger. She talked about starting over, about finally being able to breathe, about how blessed she felt that her family had come together during her hardest year. She didn't mention Marcus's name, she didn't mention mine, but she was standing in a kitchen with brand new appliances, the plastic still on the stove handle, and in the background, visible for exactly 2 seconds before the camera panned away, was a car seat I recognized because I'd helped Dana pick it out for her own son 4 months before Marcus died. It wasn't the car seat that broke something in me, it was the appliances. Marcus had been dead for 8 weeks, and somebody was standing in a kitchen he never got to see, talking about a fresh start funded by money that was supposed to keep his daughter fed. I called my mother that night. "We need to talk about the insurance," I said. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me she'd been waiting for this call and had already decided how she was going to handle it. "Simone, I know this is hard," Carol said, "but Marcus would have wanted Dana taken care of. He talked about it before he left for that fire. He said your sister needed help more than you did right now, that you had the house paid off and she had nothing." Marcus was 340 miles away 11 days before he died, I said. He didn't sign anything. He didn't talk to a notary. He didn't talk to anyone but his crew and a satellite phone. The silence that followed was longer this time and different in texture. "You don't know what he said to your father before he left," Carol said finally, but her voice had lost its certainty. "People have private conversations. Then it should be easy to explain how he was in 2 places at once," I said, "because I have his dispatch logs, and I have a notary certification, and they don't agree with each other. One of them is going to be proven wrong, Mom, and it isn't going to be the fire department." She didn't have an answer for that. What she had instead was a sentence I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since. "We were only trying to help with the baby," she said. "Dana needed it more." I asked her which baby she meant, because Iris needed it too, and Iris was the one whose name should have been on that form. My mother didn't answer that question. She hung up instead. I didn't hear from my father directly. I heard from him through the paperwork instead. 3 weeks later, when the insurance company's investigators traced the disbursement account and found that Gerald had been the one to physically deliver the beneficiary change form to the notary's shop, using his own name on the courier log because Dana had been at a pediatrician appointment that afternoon and couldn't do it herself. He'd signed for a delivery of a document he later claimed, in a recorded statement to investigators, that he'd never read closely and didn't know contained a forged signature. Nobody who worked with him for the 14 years he ran a small accounting practice believed that Gerald Whitfield failed to read a legal document before hand delivering it. I certainly didn't. There was a Tuesday in the 3rd month, unremarkable in every way except that it broke me a little, when the daycare called to say Iris had a fever and needed to be picked up, and I sat in the parking lot afterward doing the math on whether I could afford another week of missed shifts if this went on much longer, whether the modest savings Marcus and I had built together would stretch through a winter if the investigation dragged into a 2nd season. Iris was asleep in her car seat, flushed and warm, And I remember resting my forehead against the steering wheel and thinking that whatever justice eventually looked like, it wasn't going to arrive in time to make this particular Tuesday any easier. I didn't cry. I'd mostly run out of the version of grief that cries by then. I just sat there until my hands stopped shaking enough to drive. The investigation took 4 months from the day Adazi filed the complaint to the day the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit issued its findings. I won't pretend those 4 months were calm. There were nights I sat awake doing the arithmetic of my own life, what I'd have to sell, what daycare I'd have to pull Iris out of, whether the house Marcus and I bought together was going to become a house I couldn't afford to keep. There were other nights I felt something closer to clarity than grief. A strange, steady certainty that whatever happened, I wasn't going to let this be the version of the story where I stayed quiet because speaking up felt impolite. Denise Kowalczyk's notary commission was suspended pending a state review before the insurance investigation had even concluded, once handwriting analysts confirmed what I'd noticed on my own kitchen table. The signature on the form didn't match 17 years of Marcus's exemplars pulled from his department personnel file, his driver's license renewal, and a mortgage document we'd signed together 18 months earlier. The hook on the M was there in every single sample except the one that mattered. The insurance company's findings were unambiguous. The beneficiary change form was fraudulent. The notary certification was false. Since Marcus Ellery could not have appeared in person on a date when department records placed him actively engaged on a fire line 340 miles away. The funds had been dispersed in error based on that fraudulent document, and the insurer initiated a demand for full repayment from Dana, with the case simultaneously referred to the County District Attorney's Office and the State Department of Insurance for criminal review. I saw Dana in person once during that stretch. At a preliminary hearing neither of us was required to attend, but both of us did anyway. She was sitting on a bench in the courthouse hallway when I came out of a meeting with Adias, and for a second neither of us said anything. She looked smaller than I remembered, her son on her hip, a diaper bag slung across her body like something she was using to hold herself up rather than carry supplies. "I never wanted it to go this far," she said. "Which part?" I asked. "The part where you took my daughter's future, or the part where you got caught?" She didn't answer that. She shifted her son to her other hip and said, "Mom and Dad told me it was already handled. They said Marcus had talked to them about it before the fire, that it was his idea, that I just needed to sign where they told me to sign." "You submitted the claim yourself," I said. "You knew whose name was on that check." "I knew I needed it," she said, and for the first time her voice cracked in a way that didn't sound performed. "I know that's not an answer. I know it doesn't fix anything. I just need you to know I didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt you. It felt like survival, and survival doesn't always ask you to check the paperwork first." I told her that Iris hadn't gotten to check the paperwork either, and that surviving at somebody else's expense wasn't the same thing as surviving, and I walked past her into the elevator before I said something I couldn't take back in a courthouse hallway with her son watching both of us. It was the last real conversation we had before the charges were formally filed. Dana was charged with forgery and insurance fraud 6 weeks after the referral. Denise Kowalczyk was charged separately with fraudulent notarization, a felony in our state given the dollar amount involved. My father was never criminally charged. The courier log alone wasn't enough to prove he'd known what he was delivering, and he stuck to his story until the end. But the insurance company named him in the civil recovery action alongside Dana, since the disbursed funds had briefly passed through a joint account he shared with my mother before being moved into Dana's name. I didn't attend every hearing. I attended the ones that mattered, and I brought Iris's photograph in my bag each time, not to show anyone, just so I'd remember what the 4 months of arithmetic and sleepless nights had actually been for. The $500,000 was restored to me in full 11 months after Marcus died. With interest, the insurer was legally required to add for the delay. Once the criminal case resolved, and the civil recovery order was finalized against Dana's remaining assets, most of which turned out to be the car she'd bought and a portion of a security deposit on an apartment she never moved into because she couldn't make the second month's payment. She didn't have the full amount left to return. What she had left went into a structured repayment order that will follow her for years, garnishing a percentage of her wages for as long as it takes to satisfy what remains. I didn't take any satisfaction in that part. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't want my sister ruined. I wanted my daughter's future back, and those turned out to be two different things that happened to require the same court order. What I did with the money, once it finally came, was the part that mattered most to me. I didn't put it in an account I could touch on a bad day. I set up an irrevocable trust for Iris, with a trustee who isn't related to me by blood, someone Daisy recommended, a fiduciary whose entire professional reputation depends on never letting a document like the one that almost destroyed my daughter's future slip past unnoticed again. The trust pays for Iris's care and her education, and it cannot be altered by a form signed in a strip mall notary shop 2 miles from anyone's house. I made sure of that on purpose. I read every page of it twice before I signed it, checking every signature line the way I never thought to check one before. I see my mother twice a year now, at a neutral location for an hour, because I decided Iris deserves to know her grandmother exists, even though I no longer believe grief gives anyone the right to decide whose child gets protected and whose doesn't. I haven't spoken to my father since the civil case closed. I don't know if that's permanent. I know it's necessary for now. Dana reached out once, about 5 months after the sentencing, a message that said she was sorry, that she'd been drowning and made a choice she couldn't take back, that she thought about Marcus's face every day. I believe some of that is true. I believe grief and desperation can make people do things they'd never have chosen with a clear head, and I also believe that doesn't make Iris's inheritance any less stolen or any less mine to protect. Both of those things are true at the same time. I've stopped expecting them not to be. Odalys, Marcus's captain, still calls on his birthday. She was the one who pulled his dispatch records without hesitation the day I asked. No warrant, no runaround, just a woman who'd worked beside him for 6 years, understanding immediately why the timeline mattered more than department protocol did. She came to the department's memorial wall dedication the spring after the case closed, and she stood next to me while Iris, not quite 2, pointed at Marcus's name etched into the granite and said "Dada" in the flat, curious way toddlers say words they've heard but don't yet understand the weight of. Odalys didn't try to explain it to her. She just crouched down next to Iris and said, "He was the best of us," in a voice that didn't waver, and I've held on to that sentence longer than almost anything else anyone said to me that year. I went back to work as a physical therapist 8 months after Marcus died, part-time at first, because Iris needed me and because I needed somewhere to put my hands that wasn't paperwork or grief. My patients don't know any of this. They know me as someone steady, someone who shows up on time and remembers which knee they favor. And there's a strange comfort in being unremarkable to strangers after spending the better part of a year being the center of a fraud investigation that had my name in insurance company case files and county court dockets. I like being ordinary again most days. Some days it still catches me off guard how much effort ordinary takes. Iris is 2.5 now. She has Marcus's laugh, the kind that starts before the joke is finished, like he can't help himself. She doesn't know yet why some names don't come up at dinner, or why her mother reads every document twice before signing anything, even a school permission slip. She'll ask someday, and when she does, I'm going to tell her the truth, all of it, including the parts where people who were supposed to protect us decided a signature that wasn't real was an acceptable price for a fresh start. I think about the 11 days sometimes. 11 days between a document that was never supposed to exist and a phone call that changed everything else. 11 days is such a small number to hold the weight of a lie that big, and yet it was enough. It was exactly enough, because nobody expected a widow with a laminated deployment calendar on her refrigerator to notice the math didn't add up. If the people who forged that signature had asked me directly, if they had come to me and said, "Dana is drowning, can we find a way to help her?" I think I would have said yes. I think I would have found a way to help my sister without anyone needing to fake a dead man's handwriting to do it. That's the part I keep returning to, the part that never stops feeling like the real loss underneath the larger one. They didn't ask. They decided the answer in advance and forged the paperwork to make sure they'd never have to hear me say no, or yes, or anything at all. Some nights I take out the laminated deployment calendar, the one that used to hang on our refrigerator and now lives in a drawer with Marcus's Academy graduation photo and the mortgage document Priscilla Okafor used as one of her 17 exemplars. I don't need it anymore. The case is closed, the trust is funded, the calendar has no purpose left except the one it always secretly had, which was proof that I paid enough attention to notice when something didn't line up. I keep it anyway. I think some part of me wants Iris to see it someday and understand that the version of her mother who protected her wasn't a lawyer or an investigator or anyone with special training. She was just a woman with a laminated calendar and a refusal to let the math stay wrong. So I'll leave you with the same question I still ask myself some nights, once Iris is asleep and the house is quiet enough to hear my own thoughts again. If the people who are supposed to protect you decide, without asking, that your loss is something they're entitled to profit from, what do you owe them once you find out? And how long should it take you to stop asking that question and start living like you already know the answer? This video is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. If a story like this one has ever touched close to your own life, I hope it reminded you that the truth has a way of surfacing, even 11 days too late to stop the damage, and even later than that to finally set it right.